In America, there's a dream that pulls people west. The promise of land, of opportunity, of starting over in a place where the sun always shines and the soil is rich enough to grow anything. In 1846, that dream was called California. Thousands of families sold everything they owned, packed their belongings into covered wagons, and set out on a 500-mile journey across prairies, mountains, and deserts. Most made it. Their names are forgotten now, just ordinary people who became California pioneers, who built lives in the promised land. But some didn't make it. And one group, 87 men, women, and children who left Springfield, Illinois in April 1846, would become the most infamous wagon train in American history. Not because they failed to reach California, some of them did eventually, but because of what they had to do to survive the winter of 1846 to 1847, trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains with 20 feet of snow blocking their path and no food except the bodies of those who had already died. This is the story of the Donner Party. The pioneers who took a shortcut that added weeks to their journey. The families who made camp in the mountains just days before the worst winter in decades buried them alive. And the survivors who had to make impossible choices, choices that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. This isn't a murder mystery. This is something worse. This is a story about what human beings become when hope runs out. Imagine a perfect spring morning in Illinois. April 1846. The Civil War is 15 years away. California isn't even part of the United States yet. It belongs to Mexico, though not for long. The Great Western Migration is just beginning, and America is seized by a fever. Manifest destiny. The belief that Americans are meant to expand across the continent from Atlantic to Pacific, that the West is there for the taking, that California, warm, fertile, endless California, is a paradise waiting for anyone brave enough to make the journey. In Springfield, Illinois, 3 families are preparing for that journey. They've read the guidebooks. They've talked to travelers who've made the trip. They know it will be hard. 4 to 6 months of walking beside ox-drawn wagons, crossing rivers and deserts and mountains, sleeping on the ground, eating whatever they can hunt or carry. But they're ready. They're strong. They have supplies, good wagons, experienced men to lead them. What could possibly go wrong? Prologue. Springfield, Illinois, April 1846. On April 14th, 1846, 9 covered wagons rolled out of Springfield, Illinois, heading west toward Independence, Missouri, the jumping-off point for the Oregon Trail. The expedition was organized primarily by 3 men: George Donner, 62 years old, a prosperous farmer originally from North Carolina. George had been married 3 times. His first 2 wives had died, and was now married to Tamsen Eustace Donner, 45, a schoolteacher from Massachusetts. Between them, they had 7 children, including George's daughters from previous marriages, and the couple's 3 younger daughters, Frances, 6, Georgia, 4, and Eliza, 3. George's brother, Jacob Donner, 56, traveled with his wife, Elizabeth Blue Donner, 38, and their children. The Donner brothers were successful men, well respected in their community, with money saved and dreams of California farmland. James Fraser Reed, 45, was a furniture manufacturer and businessman, ambitious and headstrong. He traveled with his wife, Margaret Wilson Backenstow Reed, 32, who suffered from terrible headaches. Reed hoped California's climate might help her health. They brought Margaret's daughter from a previous marriage, Virginia, 13, and their own children, Martha Jane Patty, 8, James Jr., 5, and Thomas, 3. Margaret's elderly mother, Sarah Keyes, 70, came along despite being in the advanced stages of tuberculosis. Everyone knew she likely wouldn't survive the journey, but she wanted to die heading toward California rather than staying behind in Illinois. The Reed family traveled in style. James Reed had built an enormous wagon, a Pioneer Palace car with 2 stories, built-in beds, a stove, and even a side entrance with steps. Other travelers marveled at it, though some muttered that such a fancy wagon wouldn't survive the rough trail. The Reeds and Donners hired teamsters to drive the ox teams, young men looking for adventure or wages. Milford Milt Elliott, 28, James Smith, 25, Walter Heron, 25, and others. The Reeds also brought 2 servants, Bayless Williams, 24, and his sister Eliza, 25, who worked as the family's cook. The first leg of the journey from Springfield to Independence, Missouri, about 250 miles, took 3 weeks. It was an easy stretch, a chance to get used to the rhythm of wagon travel. Wake at dawn, hitch the oxen, walk 15 or 20 miles if you're lucky, make camp, cook dinner, sleep, repeat. On May 29, 1846, near the Kansas-Nebraska border at a place they named Alcove Springs, Sarah Keyes died. She was buried beside the trail, a gray rock marking her grave with the inscription, Mrs. Sarah Keyes, died May 29, 1846, aged 70. She was the first to die. She would not be the last. By May 12th, the party had reached Independence, Missouri, where they joined a much larger wagon train, about 50 wagons heading west together on the Oregon Trail. Safety in numbers, experienced guides, a well-traveled route. The journey to California typically took 4 to 6 months. If you left Missouri in mid-May and made good time, you'd reach California's Central Valley by September or October, well before the first snows closed the Sierra Nevada mountain passes. Everything depended on timing. And the Donner Party was about to make a decision that would destroy their timing entirely. In June, while the wagon train was still making its way across what is now Wyoming, word spread about a new route to California, a shortcut that would save time and miles. The route was promoted by a man named Lansford Warren Hastings, 27, an Ohio-born adventurer and would-be empire builder who'd published a guidebook called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. In it, Hastings described a new trail, the Hastings Cutoff, that would bypass the established California Trail and instead cut south through the Wasatch Mountains and across the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah, rejoining the main trail on the other side. According to Hastings, the cutoff would save 350 400 miles and provide easier terrain. It sounded perfect. There was just one problem. Hastings had never actually taken wagons over the route. He'd crossed parts of it on horseback and on foot, but he'd never tested whether wagons could make it through. He was essentially promoting an untested shortcut based on optimistic assumptions. When the main wagon train reached Fort Laramie, Wyoming on July 3rd, a mountain man named James Kleiman pulled James Reed aside. Kleiman had recently traveled from California back east, and he'd met Hastings. He'd also tried to follow parts of the Hastings Cutoff and found it nearly impassable. "Take the regular route," Kleiman told Reed. "The Hastings Trail is bad, very bad, don't risk it." Reed thanked him for the advice, and then ignored it entirely. On July 20th, 1846, at a place called the Little Sandy River in Wyoming, the wagon train reached a fork. The right fork led to Fort Hall in Idaho, the tried and true Oregon Trail route that thousands of pioneers had successfully traveled. The left fork led toward Fort Bridger and the untested Hastings Cutoff. Most of the wagon train, about 60 wagons, turned right toward the known route. But 20 wagons, including all 9 belonging to the Donners and Reeds, turned left. They weren't alone in taking the risk. Other families joined them: the Breens, the Graveses, the Murphys, the Eddies, the Kesebergs, and more. By the time they reached Fort Bridger on July 24th, the group that would become known as the Donner Party numbered about 87 people, men, women, and children, ranging from infants to the elderly. At Fort Bridger, they expected to find Lansford Hastings waiting to guide them personally over his cutoff. Instead, they found a note. Hastings had left a week earlier with another wagon train. He'd gone ahead but promised to mark the trail clearly. "Just follow his tracks," the note said. It would be easy. It would not be easy. For the first few days, the Donner Party made decent progress following Hastings' tracks through relatively open terrain. Then, on August 6th, at the mouth of Echo Canyon on the Weber River in Utah, they found another note from Hastings. The route ahead through Weber Canyon was too difficult for wagons, the note warned. "Wait here, send someone ahead to find Hastings. He would return and show them an alternate route." James Reed rode ahead with 2 other men to find Hastings. When they finally caught up with him, Hastings refused to come back. He was busy guiding the earlier wagon train and couldn't abandon them. Instead, he pointed vaguely toward a mountain range and told Reed, "Go up Big Mountain, blaze a new trail. It'll be fine." Reed returned to the Donner Party and delivered the news. They would have to cut their own road through the Wasatch Mountains. For the next 3 weeks, the men of the Donner Party chopped trees, moved boulders, filled ravines, and literally carved a wagon road through dense forest and steep mountain terrain. It was exhausting, back-breaking work in the August heat. They advanced maybe 1 or 2 miles per day. What Hastings had promised would save them 350 miles was instead costing them weeks. By August 30th, when they finally emerged from the Wasatch Mountains, they were 20 days behind where they should have been. And directly ahead lay the Great Salt Lake Desert. Part 1. The Desert of Despair. The Great Salt Lake Desert is a vast expanse of white nothing, 80 miles of flat, blinding, waterless hell stretching across what is now western Utah. Hastings had told the Donner Party it was 40 miles across, 2 days of travel. It was actually closer to 80 miles, and there was no water, no grass for the oxen, no shade, just searing heat during the day and bitter cold at night. The party set out across the desert on August 30th, 1846. They traveled at night when it was cooler, the white salt crust glowing eerily in the moonlight, the wagons creaking forward mile after endless mile. By the second day, the oxen were suffering. By the third day, they were dying, some from exhaustion, others from drinking the poisoned alkali water. People abandoned possessions to lighten the wagons. Reed's massive palace car was stripped down, its extra weight jettisoned into the salt. It took 6 days to cross the desert, 6 days of hell that should have taken 2. And when they finally reached water and grass on the other side, they'd lost dozens of oxen. Some families no longer had enough animals to pull their wagons and had to double up, sharing wagons and abandoning belongings. They'd also lost precious time. It was now early September. They should have been approaching California by now. Instead, they were still in Nevada, with the worst yet to come. By October, tensions in the Donner Party had reached a breaking point. People were exhausted, frightened, and angry at the delays. They knew they were dangerously behind schedule. Snow could start falling in the Sierra Nevada as early as October if they didn't reach the mountains soon and get over them before the snow. They could be trapped. On October 5th, 1846, near present-day Golconda, Nevada, 2 wagons became entangled while traveling along the Humboldt River. John Snyder, 25, a teamster driving one of the wagons, began whipping his oxen in frustration. James Reed, already on edge, ordered Snyder to stop abusing the animals. An argument erupted. Insults were exchanged, and then Snyder raised his whip handle and struck Reed across the head, opening a gash. Reed pulled out a knife. Margaret Reed, James's wife, stepped between the 2 men, trying to stop the fight. Snyder struck her with the whip handle, hitting her in the head. James Reed, seeing his wife struck, lunged forward and stabbed Snyder in the chest. Snyder staggered back, blood pouring from the wound. He looked down at the knife protruding from his body, looked up at Reed and said, "Uncle Patrick, I am dead." He collapsed and died within minutes. There was no law enforcement out here in the wilderness. No sheriff, no judge, no court. The wagon train had to serve as its own justice system. Louis Kesselberg, a 32-year-old German immigrant who'd clashed with Reed throughout the journey, immediately called for Reed to be hanged. Others were more forgiving. Reed had been provoked. Snyder had struck first. Margaret Reed had been hurt. It was a fight that had gone too far, not premeditated murder. After tense deliberation, the group reached a compromise. James Reed would be banished from the wagon train. He had to leave immediately without his family on horseback with no gun. Margaret Reed begged for her husband's life. Virginia, his 13-year-old stepdaughter, snuck him a rifle and ammunition before he left. On October 7th, James Reed rode away from the Donner Party, heading west alone toward California. His family, Margaret, Virginia, Patty, James Jr., and Thomas, would have to continue without him, praying they'd see him again in California, if they ever made it there. 2 days after Reed's banishment, another tragedy struck. A Belgian man named Hardkoop, about 60 years old, had been traveling with the Keseberg family, helping drive their wagons. But Hardkoop was old and couldn't keep up the grueling pace. Louis Keseberg, irritated and wanting to lighten his load, ordered Hardkoop out of the wagon on October 8th. Hardkoop was forced to walk. He couldn't keep up. He fell behind, staggering along the trail, begging for help. No one went back for him. Hardkoop disappeared into the Nevada desert, abandoned and alone. He was never seen again, presumably dying of exposure and dehydration somewhere along the Humboldt River. On October 11th, disaster struck again. The Donner Party had been passing through Paiute territory in Nevada. Relations with local tribes had been tense. Some immigrants had shot at Indians, and the Paiutes had begun retaliating. During the night, Paiute warriors crept into the Donner Party's camp and shot arrows into the oxen, killing or stealing 21 of them, nearly a quarter of the party's remaining draft animals. It was devastating. More families were now without enough oxen to pull their wagons. Supplies had to be abandoned. The weakest members had to walk. And time was running out. By late October, the Donner Party had finally reached the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada mountains. They were exhausted, low on supplies. Their oxen were dying, but they could see the pass ahead, the route over the mountains into California. Just a few more days, if they could just get over the pass before the snow. On October 28, 1846, the lead wagons reached Truckee Lake, now called Donner Lake, a beautiful alpine lake nestled in the mountains at about 6,000 feet elevation, just 13 miles northwest of Lake Tahoe. Beyond the lake, the pass climbed another 1,000 feet to the summit. From there, it was downhill into California's Central Valley, into safety, into the promised land. They were so close. That night, October 31st, 1846, the temperature dropped, and it began to snow. Part 2. Trapped. What hit the Sierra Nevada on the night of October 31st, 1846, wasn't a typical early season dusting. It was a massive storm, one of the worst in decades, dumping foot after foot of heavy, wet snow on the mountains. By morning, several feet had already accumulated. The Donner Party tried to push forward. They had to get over the pass. They were so close, just a few more miles. But the snow was too deep. The pass was blocked. The oxen couldn't pull the wagons through drifts that were already 5 feet deep and growing deeper by the hour. They tried again the next day, and the day after. Each time they got a little farther up the slope before being forced back by the snow and exhaustion. On November 3rd, They tried one final time. A small group made it almost to the summit within sight of the pass before being driven back by another storm. That was it. The pass was closed. The Donner Party was trapped. With the pass impassable, the emigrants had no choice but to make camp and wait for the weather to clear. Most of the party, about 60 people, settled near Truckee Lake. They found 3 small cabins that had been built by previous travelers and repaired them, covering the roofs with oxide and using whatever lumber they could scavenge. Additional crude shelters were built from wagon parts, brush, and logs. The conditions were primitive. Dirt floors, no real walls, wind whistling through gaps and snow piling up against the structures. 6 miles away, at a place called Alder Creek, the Donner families made their own camp. George and Jacob Donner and their families, about 21 people, constructed tents and lean-tos, covering them with canvas and hides. The separation would prove significant. Communication between the 2 camps would become difficult as the snow deepened, and the Alder Creek camp lacked the shelter of the cabins at the lake. At first, the situation didn't seem desperate. The party had some cattle left. They slaughtered the oxen and stored the meat, hoping it would last through the winter. California's Central Valley was only about 80 miles away. Surely someone could hike out, reach Sutter's Fort, and bring back help within a few weeks. Several men volunteered to try. On November 12th, a group including Charles Stanton, who had previously ridden to Sutter's Fort for supplies and returned, William McCutcheon, William Eddy, and others set out on foot, carrying minimal supplies. They didn't make it. The snow was too deep. They had to turn back. On November 20th, Patrick Breen, an Irish immigrant farmer traveling with his wife and 7 children, began keeping a diary. His entries would become the only contemporary written record of the Donner Party's ordeal. November 20th, 1846. Came up to this place on the 31st of last month that it snowed. We went on to the pass. The snow so deep we were unable to find the road when within 3 miles of the summit. November 21st. Fine morning. Wind W looks like spring thawing now about 12 o'clock. The weather was clearing. Maybe the worst was over. Maybe they could still get out. They couldn't. Throughout November and into December, storm after storm hammered the Sierra Nevada. The snow didn't just fall, it buried everything, 10 feet, 15 feet, 20 feet in some places, piling up in drifts that covered the cabins entirely. People had to dig tunnels through the snow just to get outside. Trees that had been 30 feet tall were reduced to stumps poking through the snow. The emigrants had to climb down into deep pits to reach wood for fires. And it was cold. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero. People slept huddled together for warmth, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Bayless Williams, the Reed family's handyman, was the first to die at the lake camp. He succumbed to malnutrition on December 14th, 1846. His body was buried in the snow. The cattle were running out. Families began eating the oxhides they'd used for cabin roofs, boiling them into a gelatinous, barely edible paste. They ate bones. They ate the family dogs. They ate mice and any other small animals they could catch. Patrick Breen's diary entries became increasingly grim. December 17th. Pleasant. William Murphy returned from the mountain party last evening. Beerless. Bayliss Williams died night before last. Milt Noah went to Donna's 8 days since, not returned yet. Think they got lost in the snow. December 20th. Night clear, froze a little. Now clear, pleasant. Winds are thawing a little. Looks delightful after the long storm. May Almighty God grant us to get away from this place. December 25th, Christmas Day. Began to snow yesterday about 12 o'clock. Snowed all night, snows yet rapidly. Wind about E by N. Great difficulty in getting wood. John Edward has to get, I am not able. Offered our prayers to God this Christmas morning. The prospect is appalling, but hope in God. Amen. By mid-December, it was clear that if they waited for rescue, they would all die. Someone had to get through the mountains to California and bring back help. Franklin Ward Graves, a 57-year-old Vermont farmer, had an idea: snowshoes. He fashioned 14 pairs of crude snowshoes from oxbows and rawhide strips. On December the 16th, 1846, a party of 17 people, 10 men, 5 women, and 2 teenage boys, prepared to make a desperate escape attempt. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. The group included Charles Stanton, 35, the bachelor who'd already proven his bravery; William Eddy, 28, determined to save his family; William Foster, 30, and his wife Sarah Ann Foster, 19; Franklin Graves, 57, and 2 of his daughters, Sarah Graves, Fosdick, 22, and Mary Ann Graves, 20, plus Sarah's husband J. Fosdick, 23, Patrick Dolan, 40, a generous Irish bachelor; Harriet Pike, 18, widow of William Pike, who died in an accidental shooting; Amanda McCutcheon, 23, whose husband had gone ahead to California; Lemuel Murphy, 12, a brave boy without snowshoes; 2 Miwok Indians, Luis and Salvador, who'd come with Stanton from Sutter's Fort, and several others. They packed 6 days' worth of food, strips of dried beef, some coffee, a little sugar. They estimated it would take them about 10 days to reach Johnson's Ranch, the nearest settlement in California, about 80 miles away. The snowshoes fit poorly. The travelers had minimal experience with them, but they had no choice. On the morning of December 16th, they said goodbye to their families. Mothers leaving children behind, fathers leaving wives, all of them knowing they might never see each other again. And then they started walking into the wilderness, hoping to reach California before they all died. Part 3. The Forlorn Hope. The first day wasn't too bad. The Forlorn Hope made it over the pass, the summit that had seemed so impossible 6 weeks earlier, and began descending the western slope. But then the weather turned. On December 18th, 2 days into their journey, a massive storm hit, blinding snow, howling winds, temperatures plummeting. The snowshoers huddled together for warmth, trying to keep moving, but they were quickly becoming disoriented. Without landmarks visible through the snow, they had no idea which direction led to California. They were lost. On December 21st, the winter solstice, the darkest day of the year, Charles Stanton could go no farther. Stanton was snowblind from the glare of endless white, and he was exhausted beyond the point of functioning. He'd already made the round trip to Sutter's Fort once. Now, on his second attempt to cross the mountains, his body gave out. He sat down in the snow, lit his pipe, and told the others to go on without him. "I'm done," he said simply. "I'll follow when I can." They left him sitting there smoking his pipe, staring at nothing. He froze to death alone in the snow. When the others looked back, he was gone, buried under fresh snowfall. By December 24th, the Forlorn Hope had been traveling for 8 days. Their 6-day supply of food was gone. They were starving, literally starving, bodies consuming their own muscle tissue, minds starting to blur with hunger-induced delirium. On Christmas Eve, they huddled together in what they called the Camp of Death, a miserable depression in the snow where they tried to shelter from another storm. That night, Patrick Dolan began to hallucinate. He was warm, he said, so warm, like a summer day. He wanted to take off his clothes. Hypothermia was setting in, the final stage where victims feel burning hot and begin removing clothing just before they freeze to death. Dolan died that night, raving about warmth and summer while snow buried him. 12-year-old Lemuel Murphy, the boy who'd bravely kept pace with the adults despite not having proper snowshoes, died on December 25th, Christmas Day. He simply closed his eyes and stopped breathing, too exhausted and starved to continue. And then, on December 26th, the survivors made a decision that would haunt them forever. They began to cut strips of flesh from Patrick Dolan's frozen corpse. The first time is the hardest. They cooked the flesh over a small fire, averting their faces from one another and weeping, according to later testimony. Some refused at first. William Eddy and the 2 Miwok guides, Luis and Salvador, wouldn't eat. But over the next 2 days, as they remained trapped by the storm with no other food, even they gave in. Starvation is a powerful force. The body's hunger overrides every moral prohibition. They ate Patrick Dolan. Then, when Lemuel Murphy's body was uncovered from the snow, they ate him too. A rule was established. No one would eat their own family members, and the bodies would be stripped and dried so they wouldn't be immediately recognizable as human flesh. It was survival. Nothing more, nothing less. By December 30th, the meat was gone. They set off again, somewhat strengthened, but still lost in the wilderness with no idea how far they had to go. On December 31st, the snowshoers came across Luis and Salvador again. The 2 Miwok men had run away days earlier, terrified that they would be killed and eaten once the other bodies were consumed. Now they were found lying in the snow, near death from exposure and starvation. The snowshoers had a terrible discussion. William Foster, desperate and half-mad with hunger, raised a gun. Someone protested, "You can't murder them." Foster's response was pragmatic and horrifying. "If we don't eat, we all die. Better 2 die than 7. He shot Luis in the head, then he shot Salvador. The 2 men who had volunteered to help guide the Donner Party to safety were murdered and butchered for food. It was the only time during the entire winter that people were murdered specifically to be eaten. On January 5th, 1847, William Eddy stumbled out of the mountains and spotted something that made him weep: smoke from a campfire. It was a Miwok village. The villagers were horrified by the walking skeletons that emerged from the forest. Eddy was unrecognizable, emaciated, frostbitten, barely able to stand. His feet were bloody stumps. He'd walked the last miles on frozen, gangrenous flesh. The Miwoks gave them food, acorn bread, and dried fish. Not much, because too much food too quickly would kill someone in their condition. Just enough to keep them alive. On January 17th, the 7 survivors of the Forlorn Hope, 2 men and 5 women, reached Johnson's Ranch, the first settlement in the California foothills. The settlers there were shocked. They followed the survivors' bloody footprints back into the forest and carried them to safety. It had taken 33 days for the Forlorn Hope to travel what should have been 10 days. Of the 17 who set out, only 7 survived. But they'd made it. And now the people of California knew that 60, 70 emigrants were still trapped in the mountains, starving to death. Rescue parties were organized immediately. Part 4. The Rescues. While the Forlorn Hope was struggling through the mountains, conditions at Truckee Lake and Alder Creek were deteriorating. Patrick Breen's diary continued to document the horror. January 24th, 1847. Louis, baby son of Louis Keseberg, died last night. January 31st. Landrum Murphy died last night. February 5. Peggy Breen, very uneasy for fear we shall all perish with hunger. We have but a little meat left. February 8th. Fine morning. Wind sub-U froze hard last night. Spitzer, Augustus Spitzer, died last night about 3 o'clock. We will bury him in the snow. Mrs. Eddy died on the night of the 7th. The emigrants had long since exhausted the cattle. Now they were living on boiled hides, bones, and whatever they could scavenge. And then they too began to eat the dead. Milt Elliott, the Reed family's teamster, died on February 9th. His body was consumed. At Alder Creek, conditions were even worse. The Donner family's tent camp offered little protection from the elements. Jacob Donner was dying. George Donner had an infected hand from a wound sustained back in October that had turned gangrenous. People were dying every few days now. Children were starving, and there was no sign of rescue. On February 5th, 1847, the first rescue party left Johnson's Ranch. 7 men, led by Aquila Glover and Daniel Rhodes, set out on foot, carrying as much food as they could carry through the deep snow. They couldn't bring pack animals. The snow was too deep. Everything had to be carried on their backs. It took them 13 days to reach Truckee Lake. On February 18th, the rescuers arrived at the lake camp. At first, they thought it was deserted. Snow covered everything. The cabins were buried. There was no smoke, no movement, no sound. Then a ghostly figure emerged from the snow, a woman, emaciated beyond recognition, her eyes hollow and desperate. It was Lavina Murphy, 36, mother of several of the children still alive in the camp. "Are you men from California, or do you come from heaven?" she asked. The rescuers were horrified by what they found. 12 people had already died. The 48 survivors were living skeletons, many too weak to stand. Children were unresponsive, staring blankly. Adults were delirious. And there was evidence everywhere of cannibalism. Human bones stripped of flesh, skulls split open to extract brains, body parts hanging from the cabin rafters like cured meat. The rescuers distributed what food they'd brought, carefully, because people in this condition could die from eating too much too quickly. But they had a problem. They couldn't take everyone out. Many of the survivors were too weak to walk, and the rescuers couldn't carry them all. They would have to make hard choices about who to save first. 23 people were deemed strong enough to attempt the journey. Most were children and women. The weakest adults, including George and Tamsin Donna, had to be left behind to wait for the next relief party. On February 22nd, the first group of survivors left the lake camp, following the rescuers back toward California. The journey would be a nightmare. The evacuees were too weak to travel far. After just a few miles, several collapsed and couldn't go on. The rescuers faced an impossible situation. If they stopped, everyone would die, but if they left the weakest behind, those people would die too. A terrible decision was made. 3 children and their guardian, an elderly man named John Denton, would be left behind with a small amount of food at a place that would become known as Starved Camp. The rescuers promised to send help back as soon as possible. They continued on with the strongest survivors, pushing through blizzards and exhaustion. Several more people died along the way, including young Ada Keserberg, only 3 years old, who froze to death in her mother's arms. On March 1st, the first group of survivors finally reached safety at Johnson's ranch. Among them was the Reed family: Virginia, Patty, James Jr., and Thomas. Their mother, Margaret, had been too weak to travel and had stayed behind at the lake. James Reed, who'd been banished from the Donner Party back in October, was waiting at Johnson's ranch. He was reunited with 4 of his 5 children. But his wife was still in the mountains, and so were dozens of others. James Reed immediately volunteered to lead the second rescue party. He was going back for his wife and for everyone else still trapped. On March 1st, the same day the first survivors reached Johnson's ranch, James Reed set out with a second relief party of 10 men. They brought food, supplies, and a grim determination to save as many people as possible. The second relief party reached the lake camp on March 3rd. The scene was even more horrific than the first rescuers had described. More people had died in the 2 weeks since the first relief. The survivors were barely clinging to life. The smell of death and decay hung over the camp. Margaret Reed was alive but severely weakened. When she saw her husband, she wept. He'd crossed the mountains alone, survived, and come back for her. At Alder Creek, the situation was desperate. Jacob Donner had died. George Donner was dying from his infected hand, delirious with fever and gangrene. His wife Tamsin refused to leave him, even though she was strong enough to travel. "I won't leave my husband to die alone," she told Reed. "Take the children, save them. But I'm staying." Reed pleaded with her. "You'll die if you stay," he said. "Your children need you." Tamsin Donner was resolute. "Save my babies. I'll stay with George." Reed had no choice but to accept her decision. He took Tamsin and George's 3 youngest daughters, Frances, 6, Georgia, 4, and Eliza, 3, and promised to care for them as his own. On March 4th, the second relief party left with 17 survivors, including Margaret Reed and the 3 youngest Donner girls. But the journey out would be far worse than anyone anticipated. On March 5th, a massive blizzard struck the Sierra Nevada. The second relief party was caught exposed on a mountain ridge with no shelter. The wind howled. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The temperature plummeted. Reed ordered everyone to huddle together and dig into the snow for protection. They sat in a circle, packing snow around themselves to create a windbreak, holding the children in the center to keep them warm. People began to freeze. Isaac Donner, age 5, stopped responding. Augustus Spitzer's brother froze solid. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally cleared on March 8th, 4 people were dead, 3 children and 1 adult. Their bodies were left in the snow. There was no way to bury them. The survivors pushed on, but many were at the breaking point. Reed left the weakest members behind at a camp, including some of the rescued Donner children and several rescuers, with minimal food and a promise to send help immediately. On March 11th, Reed and the strongest survivors finally reached Johnson's ranch. He'd saved his wife, he'd saved several children, but he'd also left people behind who might not survive. A third relief party was organized immediately. William Eddy, survivor of the Forlorn Hope, volunteered for the third relief despite still recovering from frostbite and starvation. His wife and 2 children, Margaret, James, and Eleanor, were still at the lake camp. He had to save them. William Foster, another Forlorn Hope survivor, also went back. His young son was still trapped. The third relief party of 4 men reached Starved Camp, where Reed had left survivors, on March 13th. The scene was indescribable. 3 children and 1 adult were still alive, barely. They'd run out of food days ago and had survived by eating the bodies of those who died in the storm. The rescuers found Louis Donner, age 3, sitting next to the partially dismembered body of his older brother Isaac, who'd frozen to death. Lewis had been eating his brother's flesh to survive. The rescuers gathered the survivors and continued to the lake camp. When William Eddy arrived at the Murphy cabin, he found his worst fears confirmed. His wife Margaret was dead. His daughter Eleanor, just 2 years old, was dead, and his son James, aged 3, had just died the day before. Eddy fell to his knees and wept. He'd survived hell to get back to them, and he was one day too late. William Foster's son was also dead. At the lake, only 11 people remained alive. Louis Keseberg, the German immigrant who'd called for Reed's hanging, the Breen family, relatively better off because Patrick Breen had carefully rationed their supplies, and a few others. The third relief party took out 4 survivors, mostly children, on March 14th. When they left, only Louis Keseberg remained at the lake camp, along with Tamsin Donner back at Alder Creek with her dying husband George. By late March, everyone assumed the remaining survivors were dead. No one could have survived this long without food. The spring thaw was beginning, and the snow was turning to slush. But on April 10th, 1847, a 4th relief party, really just a salvage expedition expecting to recover bodies and belongings, made its way to the camps. The party was led by William Fallon, a rough mountain man more interested in looting than rescue. When they reached the lake camp on April 17th, they found Louis Keseberg alive, the only person still at the lake. Keseberg was in horrifyingly good condition considering the circumstances. He was healthy, relatively strong, even well fed. The rescuers were immediately suspicious. They searched the cabins and found something that would damn Keseberg forever. Human flesh recently butchered and prepared, skulls that had been split open and the brains removed, a pot filled with human liver and lungs. And Keseberg was eating it, not out of desperate survival necessity. He had other food available, food that the rescuers found stashed in the cabin. He was eating human flesh by choice. "Where is Mrs. Donner?" Fallon demanded. Tamsin Donner had been alive at Alder Creek when the third relief left. Where was she now? Keseberg claimed she'd died of starvation and exposure. He'd found her body and brought it back to the camp. The rescuers didn't believe him. They accused Keseberg of murdering Tamsin Donner for her body and for her money, which was missing. Keseberg denied it. He insisted Tamsin died naturally and he'd only eaten her body after she was dead, just as he'd eaten others. The rescuers forced Keseberg to travel back with them to California. They were barely able to restrain themselves from killing him on the trail. On April 21st, 1847, Louis Keseberg became the last survivor of the Donner Party to leave the mountains. The nightmare was finally over. Of the 87 people who'd been trapped in the Sierra Nevada in November 1846, 48 survived, 39 died. Part 5. Aftermath. Who survived? Who died? The survival statistics tell a grim story. By family. The Breen family, All 9 survived, parents Patrick and Peggy and their 7 children. Patrick Breen's careful rationing and his refusal to let anyone else use their supplies ensured his family's survival. The Reed family, 5 of 7 survived. James Reed, his wife Margaret, and 4 children. 2 servants died, Bayless Williams and his sister Eliza. The Donner families, only 3 of 16 survived. George Donner's 2 teenage daughters from a previous marriage and 1 younger daughter. George, Jacob, Tamsin, and most of their children died. The Murphy/Foster/Pike families, 9 of 17 survived, but entire branches of the family were wiped out. The Graves family, 9 of 13 survived, though Franklin Graves died in the Forlorn Hope. The Eddy family, only William Eddy survived. His wife and 2 young children died. By demographics, of 29 adult men, 15 survived, 52%. Of 15 adult women, 10 survived, 67%. Of 43 children, 23 survived, 53%. Women and children had slightly better survival rates, possibly because 1. Women had more body fat, providing better insulation. 2. Women were given priority in the relief parties. Children were carried out first when possible. 3. Men often took on the most dangerous tasks, Forlorn Hope, hunting, etc. The youngest and oldest, the youngest survivor, Nancy Graves, age 1 when rescued. The oldest survivor, Lavina Murphy, age 37, not elderly but oldest adult to survive. Several infants and elderly people died early in the ordeal. Cause of death. Most died of starvation, exposure, or a combination of both. A few died of injuries or illness unrelated to the trapping, like George Donner's infected hand. At least 2, Luis and Salvador, were murdered. The accusations against Keseberg, Louis. Keseberg would never escape the accusations that he murdered Tamsin Donner. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Tamsin had been relatively healthy when the 3rd relief party left. She'd had money with her, $1,500 in gold coins, a fortune in 1847. The money disappeared. Keseberg was found with fresh human flesh, even though he had other food available. He showed no remorse and even seemed to enjoy talking about eating human flesh. In 1847, survivors publicly accused Keseberg of murder. He sued one of them, a rescuer named Reason P. Tucker, for slander, demanding $1,000 in damages. Keseberg lost the case. The court awarded him exactly $1 in damages, essentially a legal way of saying you're technically right that he called you a murderer without proof, but everyone believes you probably are one. Keseberg maintained his innocence for the rest of his life, giving interviews and writing statements claiming he'd only eaten the already dead to survive. But he also made disturbing statements. In one interview, he claimed that human liver was the most delicious meat he'd ever tasted, far superior to pork or beef. He described the taste in detail, seeming to relish the memory. Whether he murdered Tamsin Donner remains unknown, but his behavior after rescue, his apparent enjoyment of the notoriety, his detailed descriptions of eating human flesh, made him a pariah for the rest of his life. The survivors tried to rebuild their lives with varying degrees of success. James and Margaret Reed settled in San Jose, California. James became a successful businessman. He helped survivors of the Donner Party and advocated for better trails and rescue systems in the mountains. The couple raised their children plus the 3 orphan Donner girls they'd promised to care for. Margaret died in 1861, James in 1874. Virginia Reed, James's stepdaughter, wrote one of the most detailed accounts of the Donner Party ordeal years later. She married young, had 9 children, and lived to age 87, dying in 1921. She spent her later years correcting misinformation about the Donner Party and defending her family's actions. Patrick Breen, whose diary provided the only contemporary account, settled in San Juan Bautista, California. He and his wife Peggy raised their 7 surviving children. Patrick died in 1868 at age 71. Peggy died in 1874 at age 75. Their descendants became prominent California families. William Eddy, who lost his entire family, never fully recovered from the trauma. He remarried and had more children, but died young in 1859 at age 41, his health permanently damaged by his ordeal in the mountains. Louis Keseberg lived until 1895, dying at age 81 in Sacramento. He tried various businesses but was never successful. His reputation as a cannibal followed him everywhere. People refused to do business with him. He and his wife eventually ran a boarding house. He gave several interviews late in life, always maintaining he'd never murdered anyone, always insisting he'd only done what he had to do to survive. The young Donner girls, Frances, Georgia, and Eliza, were raised by the Reed family as promised. All 3 married and had families. They rarely spoke publicly about their ordeal, wanting to leave the past behind. The survivors suffered what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD, nightmares and flashbacks. Survivor's guilt, especially among those who'd eaten human flesh. Depression and anxiety. Difficulty forming attachments. Physical ailments that never fully healed. Many survivors moved frequently, perhaps trying to escape their past. Some changed their names or refused to discuss the Donner Party. Parents who'd survived often never told their children about what happened in the mountains. The psychological burden of cannibalism was especially heavy. In 1847, America, cannibalism was considered one of the most depraved acts imaginable, worse than murder. Survivors who'd eaten human flesh carried shame and guilt for the rest of their lives, even though they'd done so only to survive. Several survivors gave public statements insisting they'd never eaten human flesh, even when evidence suggested they had. The shame was too great to admit. Part 6. The blame. Who was responsible? In the aftermath, people wanted someone to blame for the disaster. Various parties were held responsible. Lansford Warren Hastings bore the most blame. His shortcut had added weeks to the journey and put the party behind schedule. He'd promoted a route he'd never fully tested with wagons. He'd abandoned them in the Wasatch Mountains rather than guiding them as promised. Hastings never publicly apologized or accepted responsibility. He continued promoting himself as a frontier guide and later became involved in various schemes to colonize South America. He died in 1870 of yellow fever in Brazil, still promoting his own greatness. James Reed was blamed by some for pushing too hard to take the shortcut despite warnings. His murder of John Snyder and subsequent banishment had also weakened the party by removing one of its strongest leaders. But Reed redeemed himself by organizing rescue parties and personally saving many lives. Most survivors spoke highly of him after rescue. The Donner brothers, George and Jacob, were blamed for being too trusting of Hastings and too slow in their decision-making once they were behind schedule. But they paid for their mistakes with their lives and the lives of most of their families. Louis Keseberg was blamed not for the disaster itself, but for his behavior during and after the accusations of murder, the apparent enjoyment of cannibalism, the missing money. Margaret and William Murphy, no relation, were blamed by some for poor decisions at the lake camp. The weather ultimately was the biggest factor. The winter of 1846 to 1847 was one of the worst in Sierra Nevada history. Even if the Donner Party had been on schedule, they would have faced terrible conditions. But being weeks behind schedule turned a harsh winter into a death trap. Historians have endlessly debated the what-ifs of the Donner Party. What if they'd taken the traditional route? They almost certainly would have reached California safely before the snow. The traditional route was longer in miles but much faster in time because the trail was established and didn't require cutting roads through mountains. What if they'd turned back from the Hastings Cutoff? At several points they could have abandoned the cutoff and returned to the main trail. It would have been humiliating but safe. Pride and stubbornness kept them going forward. What if they'd arrived at the pass 1 week earlier? Just 1 week earlier, the pass was still open. If they'd pushed harder, abandoned more wagons, made different choices about rest days, any of a dozen small decisions, they might have made it over before the snow trapped them. What if they'd sent more people with the forlorn hope? More people attempting the snowshoe escape might have meant more survivors reaching California earlier, enabling faster rescue operations. What if the rescuers had arrived sooner? The first relief party didn't reach the camps until February 18th, 3 months after the party was trapped. Faster response might have saved lives, though the deep snow made earlier rescue nearly impossible. The Donner Party disaster led to several immediate changes in Western migration. 1. Better information. Accurate guidebooks and maps were published, warning emigrants about dangerous shortcuts and unreliable guides. 2. Improved timing. Later wagon trains planned their departures more carefully to ensure they'd cross the Sierra Nevada by early October at the latest. 3. Rescue infrastructure. California established formal rescue systems with supplies cached at strategic points and volunteers organized to respond to emergencies. 4. The railroad. The disaster highlighted the need for better transportation across the Sierra Nevada. In 1863, construction began on the first transcontinental railroad, which would cross the mountains approximately 10 miles north of where the Donner Party was trapped. The railroad was completed in 1869. 5. Legal protections. California passed laws requiring anyone leading wagon trains to be qualified and knowledgeable. Guides could be held liable for reckless decisions that endangered emigrants. Over time, the Donner Party became more than a historical tragedy. It became a myth, a cautionary tale, a symbol of humanity's capacity for both heroism and horror. The story was sensationalized in newspapers. Lurid accounts focused obsessively on cannibalism, often exaggerating or inventing details. The survivors became celebrities and freaks, simultaneously pitied and reviled. By the late 1800s, Donner Party had entered American vocabulary as shorthand for disaster, for desperate measures, for the breakdown of civilization. The site itself became a tourist attraction. By the 1860s, people were visiting Donner Lake to see where the tragedy occurred. Hotels were built. Tour guides showed visitors the cabin sites and told gruesome stories. In 1918, a monument was erected at Donner Memorial State Park. It stands 22 feet tall, representing the depth of the snow that winter. An inscription reads, "Virile to risk and find, kindly withal and a ready help, facing the brunt of fate, indomitable, unafraid." The survivors and their descendants hated the attention. They wanted the Donner Party to be forgotten, wanted to move beyond the horror. But the story wouldn't die. It resurfaces every generation in books, films, documentaries, podcasts. The Donner Party remains one of the most famous and most horrifying stories in American frontier history. Epilogue. What it means. Donner Memorial State Park sits on the eastern shore of Donner Lake, at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It's a beautiful place. Pine forests, crystal clear water, stunning mountain views. Thousands of people visit every year. Some come to learn the history. Others come to boat on the lake or hike the trails, barely aware of what happened here. The park's museum displays artifacts recovered from the campsites: buttons, tools, bone fragments, personal items. There are interpretive signs explaining what occurred during that terrible winter. But standing at the site, it's hard to truly comprehend what happened. The cabins are long gone. The snow melts every spring. Trees have grown over the campsites. Nature has healed. Only the stories remain, and the bones, occasionally still unearthed by construction or erosion, silent testimony to those who died here. Interstate 80 now crosses the Sierra Nevada just south of where the Donner Party was trapped. Modern travelers drive from Nevada to California in a few hours, air-conditioned comfort, listening to podcasts, completely oblivious to the fact that 170 years ago, people starved and froze and died trying to cross these same mountains. The pass that defeated the Donner Party, now called Donner Pass, is traversed by thousands of vehicles every day. In winter, when snow closes the highway, travelers are merely inconvenienced, not trapped for months. We've conquered the mountains that killed the Donner Party, but we haven't forgotten what happened here. Every telling of the Donner Party story, eventually arrives at the same uncomfortable question. What would I have done? Would you have eaten human flesh to survive? Would you have been able to make that choice? It's easy to say never when you're fed and warm and safe. It's easy to judge from a distance 175 years later with no concept of true starvation. But the survivors weren't monsters. They were ordinary people, farmers, mothers, children, who found themselves in an extraordinary situation. They'd already eaten their cattle, then the ox hides, then bones and mice and anything remotely edible. They'd watched their children grow weaker every day, knowing they would die without food. And then someone died, and their body was there, and the choice became, let everyone die or eat the dead to save the living. Most of us would like to believe we'd choose noble death over such depravity. Most of us would be wrong. The Donner Party survivors proved that given extreme enough circumstances, human beings will do whatever is necessary to survive, will break every moral rule, will become things we never imagined we could become. And then, if we're fortunate enough to survive, we'll spend the rest of our lives trying to reconcile who we became with who we thought we were. But there were also acts of extraordinary heroism in the Donner Party story. Charles Stanton, who made the round trip to Sutter's Fort and back when he could have stayed in California, returning to the trapped party even though he owed them nothing. He died trying to lead others to safety. Tamsin Donner, who refused to leave her dying husband even though staying meant certain death. She died beside him, choosing love over survival. The rescuers, who risked their lives multiple times climbing into the mountains in winter to save strangers. Several nearly died in the process. The forlorn hope survivors, who endured unimaginable suffering but never gave up, dragging themselves through the snow for 33 days to bring help. James Reed, who was banished for murder but returned to save his family, and dozens of others, leading relief parties and spending his own money to organize rescues. The Donner Party story isn't just about cannibalism and death. It's also about resilience, sacrifice, love, and the indomitable human will to survive. We remember the Donner Party not because we enjoy horror stories, though the macabre details certainly capture attention. We remember because the story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Civilization is fragile. We're never more than a few days of hunger away from becoming something else entirely. We're not as strong as we think. Or maybe we're stronger than we can imagine. It's impossible to know until tested. Arrogance kills. The decision to take Hastings' shortcut was driven by pride and the belief that they knew better than those who warned them. Timing matters. Small decisions, one more day of rest, one last attempt to salvage wagons, compounded into catastrophe. We need each other. The families who shared resources and helped one another had better survival rates. Those who hoarded and isolated themselves often died. The Donner Party story is a warning about hubris, poor planning, bad luck, and the price of desperation. But it's also a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, some people remain human. Some share their last scraps of food. Some refuse to abandon the dying. Some risk everything to save strangers. Before we end, we should remember them not as the Donner Party, not as a collective tragedy, but as individuals. They weren't characters in a story. They were real people who walked across America chasing a dream, who got trapped by snow and bad timing, who did what they had to do to survive. Some made it, some didn't. All of them deserve to be remembered for more than just how they died or what they ate. On April 21st, 1847, Louis Keseberg walked out of the mountains and down into California's Central Valley. Behind him, buried in the snow and scattered through abandoned cabins, lay the bodies of 39 people who hadn't made it. Ahead of him lay a life forever marked by what had happened in the mountains, a life he would spend defending himself, explaining himself, trying to make people understand that he'd done what he had to do to survive. The snow would melt, the bodies would decay, the cabins would collapse, the forest would reclaim the campsites. But the story would never die. Because the Donner Party isn't just history. It's a mirror that shows us what we might become when everything is stripped away. The good and the bad, the heroic and the horrifying, the strength and the breaking point. Remember the people who camped at Truckee Lake in November 1846, watching the snow fall and wondering if they'd ever see spring again. Remember that they were people like you, families like yours, dreams like everyone's dreams. Remember that they didn't know they would become famous. They didn't know their names would be taught in schools, their story retold for centuries. They just wanted to reach California, to build new lives, to see their children grow up in the promised land. Remember that winter doesn't care about your plans. Mountains don't care about your dreams. And sometimes, despite your best efforts, despite your courage and strength and determination, you end up trapped in a place where there are no good choices left. Only survival or death. And the question of what you're willing to do, what you're capable of doing to see one more sunrise. The Donner Party made their choice. What would yours be? Sleep well, if you can.